Well, we might as well begin. We can kick things off. And for anyone who is watching this after the fact, feel free to reach out to us. Our team is on LinkedIn, as well as I'm sure you've got a few of our emails as well. So thank you so much today for joining our How to Align API Metrics with Business Objectives. Now, today we're going to be talking about it's kind of the invisible world of where a lot of times we have these different business objectives that don't seem like they necessarily tie directly into the, into that world. And what we're going to do today is explore how you can start to align those API metrics to actually push forward those business objectives. And not always is it super straightforward. So there we go. So who am I? I am Matt Tanner. I am the head of developer relations here at Moesif, and I focus mostly on API first strategy, monetization, and PLG. So I think most of you probably are part of our newsletter. You'll see a lot of the content that me and my team put out is around those types of topics. And my background is initially in enterprise and then moved into startups. So I'm able to look at things kind of from both worlds. So to kick things off, well, we hear this all the time. We hear API as a product. So when we look at APIs as products, what does that really mean? So when we think of, traditional way of creating an API, someone, a developer quickly codes it up, we deploy it, we use it, and it doesn't necessarily fit that product lifecycle. When you start to treat APIs as products, you start to look at kind of these 5 high-level domains, which are the high-level roadmap and strategy for the API. So what is it going to do? How is it going to evolve? All these types of things. The architecture and design of the API. So thinking beyond just, hey, let's quickly scale up a quick Node Express API and see what it does. You want to actually have some of that stuff planned out. You want to be able to also start to define and measure KPIs for that API. And that could be business KPIs, it could be technical KPIs, anything in between. What you also see, and we've seen a massive push in this probably within the last 5 years, is this idea of being able to grow and monetize and basically create revenue streams from APIs. And then lastly, as you evolve your APIs, you want to be able to iterate and deprecate them. So when we look at metrics that are associated with that, we tend to find that, and if you talk to your DevOps team, if you talk to your engineering team, you're likely going to see that a lot of the metrics focus more on infrastructure health. So we look at stuff like uptime and SLA, memory usage, latency, errors per minute, requests per minute. And these are all great. You have to have these. But when it comes to aligning it with those kind of business objectives, it's much tougher to do that with these types of metrics. Now, they're still going to factor into it, because let's look at uptime and SLA. For instance, from a business perspective, you might want to, as part of your sales proposition, say that your API has a 99.999 uptime guarantee. So they definitely factor in, but it definitely want to go beyond what these metrics are. And that's because the product teams are accountable for delivering actual customer value and not infrastructure. So what matters to the DevOps team and making sure things run smoothly doesn't necessarily equate to what product teams care about. What product teams tend to care about are adoption, engagement and usage, and retention. And of course, if we go back to these metrics here, they do factor into that. So if you have high latency, you probably are not going to see great retention or usage. If you, let's just say, have a high errors per minute, then adoption might be a little bit lower because people are getting bogged down by errors. So they do connect, but you still want to look at them as separate things. You want to take them into consideration, but product teams should be focusing on these. Now, a lot of product teams are not, we don't always have a very technical product team. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But what you'll find is that if you're a product team and you have this experience with developers, you've probably already learned that developers don't really have an easy go when it comes to adopting an API. So getting them to adopt it can be quite hard. And that's because developers are skeptical. So we think about, here's this API, you should use this API. So from a marketing and product perspective, we're pushing them to use this, but they're skeptical of this. This is actually going to solve my needs. Another thing is they don't tend to trust non-technical people. So myself being an engineer, if I hop onto a sales call for an API and I want to learn more about it, I'm probably going to ask, can I chat with an engineer? We also tend to not enjoy integration work. So integrating with an API hopefully is seamless, but most of the time it's not, especially if you don't have the right analytics in place to gauge how easy that integration is. So we don't necessarily like that work a whole lot. We also have higher priority tasks. So when you think about someone from the API consuming end, their product team says, hey, it'd be really cool if we could use this API. We need an engineer to do it. The engineers are probably tied up doing other stuff. They're usually highly utilized and tackling those high priority tasks. And if you have worked with any technical team before, number 5 should resonate with you. You'll go and say, hey, it would be really great if we could use this product. And the engineering team says, let's build it ourselves. So, it's not invented, the have not invented here syndrome. So we'll build it ourselves type of thing. So in order to get the developers to start using these tools and these APIs, we really need to start pushing through where the value gain is. So in order for a developer to start using the API, you need to show a value to engineering, you need to show a business value, and you need to show value to leadership. Value to engineering, that comes usually pretty easy. So easy onboarding, easy integration, making sure that uptime is good, all these types of things. Engineers value good engineering. So you want to deliver good engineering. The next is the business value portion of things. So great, you have the developer using an API, but now you also need to deliver a business value so that you can start to, as you can see from the money bag here, actually start to drive some revenue from it. And the last part is the value to leadership. Usually the engineering team and potentially even the business team itself doesn't have the final say to bring an API in. So you want to be able to give them a reason to talk to leadership and get that final sign off. So since we're treating APIs as products, we want to kind of understand how product adoption works. First, we need to understand what transactions create customer value. When we're building an API and we are trying to, as the title of the webinar says, align our API metrics with business objectives, we want to start to show people this API solves this problem for you. And that means that in e-commerce, we might have a checkout or a purchase API. SaaS, integrating, or a data send API. Data API, successful lookup or match, or a logistics API might be something like creating an order. These are where customer value is created. Now, as you create that customer value and you get people onboarded, so really what we just talked about there is really this kind of section here. First hello world, realized value. So if you deliver an API that delivers these types of functionalities, you're going to see first hello world, which for those of you who are not familiar, this is folks who have signed up, integrated, and then actually used the API. So time to first hello world. There's also, some people call it time to first call. There's different kind of acronyms for it. And then this realized value, which is people continuing to use the API, which is how you drive revenue, and it's also how you drive value for them. But what you'll see a lot of times, we focus on the product part here, but we also need to focus on this part here. So if our objective is to sell our API more effectively, then we need to look at just the technical part. We need to look at the non-technical too. So then we start to map out these funnels. So when we talk about adoption, this is kind of that adoption funnel. So we have page visit, and then let's just say they visit a blog, they visit a landing page, paid ad, something like that. The next step is sign up. We want to start to understand what stuff is bringing people to our site or to our platform. We want to figure out who is signing up, how long it's taking, and what percentage of people. So if we look at this chart, it takes about 10 minutes for people to come from their initial page visit to sign up, and about 60% of our users are doing that. Then from sign up to first hello world, now we have 30%, and it takes about 6 hours. These are where you start to look at those API metrics and align it with those business objectives. So if our objective is to get someone, if we say our platform is so easy to use that you can be integrated in 15 minutes, but then we see from sign up to first hello world takes 6 hours, we're not really delivering on that. So if using a platform like Moesif, what you can do is you can actually look at these sections here. So how long does it take for someone to go to sign up to first hello world? If you don't have the right metrics and observability in place, you're not going to be able to see that. You're also not going to be able to see the amount of people. So if we're converting 30% of people, we now might try and figure out how we can make that more effective. So different marketing campaigns, where are these people coming from? What's the demographic? We might find that some of the people that we have coming to our sign up are just not our target demographic. So we can then use it kind of holistically from a business objective perspective. I look at it from marketing and sales. So we can start to hone in a lot of that stuff. And this is exactly what I was kind of mentioning, is we have these web actions, which a lot of times when we think about API metrics, we don't include those. All we care about is this here, but that's not necessarily the whole picture. We want to make sure that the funnel or the path that we're pushing people down to actually use the API is effective and working as we anticipate. So when you create this funnel, you're going to create the funnel based on key milestones and frequency. So if we look at this chart here, we might do something where a user action, they've signed up, and that was performed at least one time. Then they went to, and this will be, let's just say, an e-commerce API, where they would have a request.route, which is equal to /payment, and they perform that at least one time. And then you have this returned part. So this request.route is /payment, and they performed it at least 100 times. So what we want to see here is we want to be able to start mapping out how this, like in real life, how we take this chart from kind of theoretical into a practical approach. And this is how we can do it. So now we can start to see that we have 100% of people that are coming into our sign up funnel. And then out of those, we have a conversion rate of 49%, and it takes 6 hours and 5 minutes for them to make their first API call. Then we can see that for them to make a subsequent 100 calls, it's going to take 7 hours and 30 minutes longer. Super important, because as you get those objectives from the business, like we need to be able to onboard people more quickly, or people should be making 5,000 calls or 100 calls in the first 3 hours of onboarding to our API. So you have these business metrics, and then you can start to map them out. You can see what your baseline is. And then from that baseline, then you can start to improve it. So you can start to align the API metrics with the actual places where the business wants to go. Now, one tip for this is to guide customers on how to see value. So we've got people using the API. We figured out how to bring them in. So if we look at this here, we figured out how to bring people from sign up into their first API call. But how do we get them into this a bit better? How do we get them to be a retained customer better? A really great way to do this is to use some type of behavioral email mechanism. So based on a specific criteria, let's send an email. In this case, we have new users who didn't send API transactions in 7 days. So you can see how you would dial that in. Last seen time doesn't exist. and it was created after 7 days ago. If they didn't call the slash purchases route, I want to send them an email, and I'm going to let them know, like, hey, we saw that you signed up but haven't integrated yet. What we see, and it's funny because I just signed up for an API service recently to check something out, and they did a really great job of this. It was a web scraping API. And I think after like 3 hours, I got an email that says, hey, looks like you still haven't called the API. If you need help, here's a direct line to our customer success team. Then a day later, then 7 days later, and then 14 days later, as you come to the end of your trial, let's just say. These are really important because you may have users slip through the cracks, but if you guide them, maybe they got totally confused by the docs and they just need one of those human touches to make sure that they can get back on the right track. So this is where you'd want to kind of leverage that type of stuff. So once we've got through the adoption portion of things, we've got people integrated, onboarded. Now we want to actually make sure that customers remain engaged. So when we think about how we measure API engagement, when we look at the older way of doing it, we would look at requests per second. So this is the equivalent, if you've done anything in the marketing space, to look at something like, hey, our business is doing great because we have 1 million page views per month on our website. But we know that really doesn't mean that much. We know that it can be used as a metric, but it's not really telling of how much value we're bringing. A better way of looking at it would be weekly active tokens. So how many API tokens or whatever are used over the week. So instead of just requests per second, we can actually see that, hey, you might have one company that's using it consistently. And here we see a chart on the side here that shows weekly active API tokens. But API tokens also is not super accurate because you might have one API token being used by 10 people, or you might have 10 API tokens being used by one person because they have a bunch of different environments. So it doesn't really show kind of how integrated it is. The best way to look at things is through this here, which would be weekly active users. So if we have 100 users using our API, that's a better kind of metric to go off of versus weekly active tokens, where you could have one developer using 100 tokens. If that developer decides to stop using the API, those 100 tokens are gone. Versus weekly active users, it's more easier to see their retention and engagement. Next, you want to actually add the user attributes to understand who is using the platform. So we can start to kind of push together what I would call like an API-centric CRM. And here we can start to look at stuff such as customer name or industry. What's their primary use case? So, are they doing mobile development? Are they machine-to-machine APIs, desktop or web APIs? You can figure that kind of stuff out, and you can usually identify that through, SDK. You can also figure out their role or experience level. So you might want to see if there's a high amount of errors coming from junior developers versus senior developers. There might be a gap in documentation, a gap in knowledge that you could start to fill in. And you also, especially for someone like myself who really is engaged in the marketing side of things, I also want to know how they're discovering my API so that I can find that, hey, users that come in through LinkedIn have a much higher engagement. So if they come in through LinkedIn, they're 30% more likely to integrate and become an active customer. You're able to figure these things out, but you have to make sure that you bind these user attributes with the usage attributes, which is where I kind of come across that CRM portion of things. And I'll show you what that looks like in the app itself. So with attributes, you can start to break down the usage by customer demographic. And what we mean here is if I just show you, here's what API calls look like for the week, and everything is trending upwards. But what we're finding is that actually our big customers, they're starting to taper off, which means we could have a lagging metric there where Later, even though it's going up, we have a lot of new companies coming in, but they're using a lower amount of actual usage and a higher amount of usage, but our large customers are starting to drop off. And to give you kind of an example here, what I can show is if I made a chart and grouped the API usage by company name, and let's say the top 10 companies, and I want to look at the event total, so how many API calls they used, I could start to look at stuff like this. Like, hey, you know what? We have Discord, which is, I think that's the Discord logo, I think. And they're dropping off. We can see that there's a massive drop off here for Dropbox. And you can start to see overall what's going on, but you can also see at a more granular level. And this is what you want to look at. So what you might see is that you have multiple companies similar to, let's say, Intuit or similar to Walmart, where, hey, you know what, maybe we should go after big box vendors, or maybe we should go after finance vendors because they seem to be doing a lot more work with our API than, let's say, the Dropboxes of the world. So you can start to determine that, and you can figure out by customer demographic how engaged these companies are, how engaged the users are, and so on and so forth. Now, after we start to figure that stuff out, we also probably want to try and measure the actual data that corresponds with like the value delivery, not just the API endpoint itself. So, and the next slide actually is going to help me break this down a bit further, but you don't just want to do things necessarily by API call. So for e-commerce API, you might want to figure out categories that are often out of stock. So how often does someone go to do a purchase or add to cart and receives an out of stock? When it comes to looking at the value there, or the API value that you're delivering, you can allow the functionality to happen. So allow them to actually add stuff to their cart. But what you can also do is deliver extra insights. And we have some customers that do this, by the way, that what they'll do is they initially started using our platform to track those higher level API metrics, and then went, well, we have the request and the response bodies, so we can actually start to formulate these different types of insights as well. So, you know, the data API one is an easy one for us to relate to. Like, how often do API calls return back a found, or what's the match rate? So if I have an API, I'll give an example, Clearbit, for instance. So Clearbit API, where I can pass an IP address, and then it will, if it's available in the API, it's going to return back some data. How often is my API actually returning back data to customers? If I create a chart and I see that only 10% of the time the user is getting a result based on the IP they've passed, then it might not be high value for them because they're only covering 10% of potential customers. Whereas if I start to see 90%, I can go, okay, my API is fulfilling that value. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, when we talk about this one here, the e-commerce one, what we can do is we can actually analyze the request and response payloads to see how often people are receiving an out of stock. So we can see in this chart here where in the body, in the response body, the label is going to be either unavailable, available, or out of stock. And we can start to see how often this is happening. So even better than this, we could actually dial this in further and see exactly what items are being returned as out of stock. So we can see, you know, maybe this is a popular item that's consistently out of stock. So we can start to look at business metrics through the API request and response payloads. And when we think about, you know, business intelligence applications, stuff like that, essentially everything that's contained in the request and response payload is what you would look at in those as well. So being able to see it in a single platform and explore the tech side and the business side is quite powerful to do. You can also combine customer attributes and payload analysis. So you can actually start to see who's having a bad experience. So what we can see here is top customers by response body label. So we can see that these people are using our purchase API. And these are all of the folks who, sorry, this is the top 5 companies and the responses. So Asana, for instance, if we can see here, they've done a bunch of API calls, and 1,000 times they've got back an unavailable response or an unavailable body.label. And we can see here that Liberty Mutual is the highest in terms of they keep on trying to get something and they're getting it out of stock. So we could actually use the metrics that we have and dig further into this. We could figure out who in Liberty Mutual is trying to retrieve something that's out of stock. Let's say, again, an e-commerce API, or maybe it's a distribution API or something like that. But then we can dig in and figure out what products are missing. We can start to dig into more of the business side of it. Because as an API developer, I want to make sure that it returns the correct data to you. So as an API developer, I want to make sure that you can receive unavailable, available, or out of stock. But as a business, I want to know who is receiving that. So you can start to fill in a lot of those business questions as well. Now you've got users onboarded, you've got them engaged, and the best way to kind of build a business is to continue to retain those customers because it's very expensive to onboard new customers. And we want to start to understand how product retention looks from an API perspective. So when we look at API retention, so this is how often users are continuing to use the API, we can figure out if we have a leaky boat, as it shows on this slide. So we can figure out where stuff begins to taper off. And I really, really like this approach to API retention because I think it's something that a lot of folks kind of miss out on. And they try really hard to bring people in the door, but they don't understand if their users are staying with them. So here in this chart, we can see that for our generic API, for this specific date, so let's just say the 22nd of July, 23rd, 24th, and so on and so forth, we can see the amount of people who have come to use the API. Total of 173. And this is what I want to focus on here is at the top. I know it might be a little hard for folks to see, but what we have is day 0, 100% of these users use the API at least one time. By day 1, which is the second day, if we're talking about array here, array data starting at 0. So day 1, we're down to 37%. So we have about 40%, 60% of folks have already stopped using the API by day 1. Day 2, 28, day 3, 29, day 4, 28, and then day 5, 24. And a general retention curve is going to drop pretty steeply. It might not drop as steeply depending on what your API functionality is, but eventually it should flatten out. Your customers that are continuing to use the APIs hopefully do continue to use the APIs. But you can start to improve this and very, 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 very quickly really increase your bottom line by what if we moved from 37.5 on day 1? What if we were able to bring that retention up to 45? Or what about 50%? Now, if the curve stays the same, now we would start to see this flatten out a little bit higher, which means if people are paying for API usage, we have more users using the API more consistently, which also leads to better revenue. And, when we talk about stuff like a revenue retention, net dollar retention, all these types of things, this is the report that I think a lot of folks kind of miss out on, is looking at, okay, I brought people in. How do I make sure that they're continuing to use the API? So when we talk about actually looking at API retention, we can look at a few areas of improvement. This one here, this is a big one actually, is programming languages or SDKs. So if you are building SDKs and SDKs are bringing back, let's just say, for instance, we got a Python SDK and a Java SDK. We might create a chart like this that shows the Java SDK, and the Java SDK retention is quite high. And then all of a sudden, we look at our Python SDK. And the Python SDK is, let's just say, is lower like this. Now we can start to ask questions. Why are users using the Python SDK not being retained as well as the Java SDK ones? Now, what we can do is we can go back to some of our engagement charts and some of our different reports. And maybe what we find out is that our Python SDK has a ton of errors. Or we might find that folks that are using the Python SDK are intermediate level developers or just don't have a very high traffic volume, whereas our Java SDK users are senior level developers who are doing like more intensive use cases, so they have a higher amount of API calls. What does it mean? It means that we either can make a decision to double down on going after the folks that are using the Java SDK, or we might go, if it's something to do with errors or something like that, we might go and look at our Python SDK and say, okay, let's fix this SDK so it works better for our users. And then we can do a later retention report and start to compare. This is what it looked like before. After our SDK updates, our retention is significantly higher. So that's the hopeful outcome for it. But being able to actually look at these types of metrics is important because all of us have a limited amount of resources in order to work on our products. So if no one is using our Python SDK, but we're spending 90% of our time fixing it, then, that's a problem from a business perspective. We should be doubling down on the ones that are being used. We also might look at stuff like API versioning. So we might find that folks that are on V3 of our API are not being retained as well as those on V2, which means maybe our last stable release. In that case, we might look at error rates. We might look at API call volume. There's tons of different things we could look at to figure out why the retention is not happening as well for things within a specific API version. And we might look at features used. So we might look at if users, I'll give you an example just with Moesif. So we might find that with Moesif, customers or users that use a time series report at least once a week have a higher chance of being retained or have a higher retention rate. Again, I'm just making that up just in the context of our product, but these are the types of insights that you want to look at. So if you know that folks using a specific feature are being retained better, you can start to use some of those engagement tactics and some of those onboarding tactics like automated emails to push people towards that feature. If a feature is helping with retention, push more people towards it, and hopefully that means that your overall retention and your overall revenue will increase. Now, here's what I was chatting about before, where fixing an SDK issue via retention curves. So we can see here in this little breakdown that we've got a Node, Python, Go, and Ruby SDK, and then a PHP SDK. And what we see is that after day 2, no one uses it. So now we can start to investigate, is it because PHP developers are a bad fit for our API, or is it because of something within the product itself? So trying to balance kind of the tech and the business side of it. So since APIs are invisible, you want to show measurable value. For tech teams, this is not really groundbreaking because we tend to find that a lot of work goes on behind the scenes that might not be looked at as super valuable because people don't see what it's actually delivering on the other side. So we want to start looking at stuff like SLA metrics, like latency. So if we can make a API have less latency, it delivers value more quickly, probably get better retention, better engagement, those types of things. We also want to look at API usage or number of transactions. So we should show people, hey, we built this new API and, last week we had 100 users using it. Now we have 1,000. Look at that growth. We can see that more people are coming into the platform. And we also want to look at unique end users or apps using the API. So some folks, if we look at Moesif, for instance, you might segregate things by user, or you might do it via app or via company. You can start to show, hey, this week we added 20 new logos, or this week we added 50 new users to our API. These are the types of things that you can go back to the business and say, our API is driving this level of business growth. So what you want to do also is, again, email is something that is very, very powerful, but I think often underutilized within the API kind of developer user experience stuff. So keeping customers informed of quota limits or deprecations. So if we look at this here, this is a friendly reminder saying that you're 100%, 104% over your plan's quota. By making sure that customers are happy, and I always go back to the example of an AWS bill, but we've all kind of signed up for something, let's just say pay as you go or something with overage fees, where we go, I totally did not know that I was going to get slammed with that bill. I wish someone had sent me something saying I was already at my quota. This is exactly what we're talking about doing here. And this is going to help with engagement. It's going to help with retention as well. Retention, so people don't get sticker shock. And from an engagement perspective, if they're only using 50%, they might go, oh, we can use even more of it. This is great. Let's continue to kind of bump up our usage. So if there is one takeaway from here that I can go through, would really be optimize for value creation and don't just base it off of, requests per second. Oh, our API is doing 10,000 requests per second. There's really not much saying around like what the business value is there. What you want to do is optimize for value creation. So this month, like let's just say Clearbit, for instance, this month we delivered 1 million IP results. Great. That is showing value versus this month we did 10 million requests. Okay, but how many actually delivered value? So that's what you want to take a look at. So I'm going to go through a really, really quick demo for you. I've got a few things I want to show you just in the last moments here, but I'm going to leave this slide up for a second. If you want to chat with us at all about any of this stuff, we've got, as you can see from our logos here, we've got lots of companies that we've worked with to implement API analytics and help them to further along their use cases and really build in that business value that you can get out of APIs. All right, let's jump to a quick demo here. I'm going to show you a few things just within our tool, just show you how easy it is to build stuff out. So within our tool, this is Moesif. For those of you who haven't logged into it before, you have quite a few functionalities here. So we've got dashboards, and I'll quickly click through these. I can show basically anything that's applicable to these specific teams or areas. I can build a dashboard for this, and I can edit these, and I can play around with them. I can override date ranges, filters, all these types of things. With Moesif, when we talked about being able to measure API usage and different metrics by user or by company or by app, Moesif actually allows you to do that. So if I click on users, you can see here that I can see all of the users that are using my API. Again, this is demo data, but I could click on these users and I could explore their usage a bit further. Actually, I will do that quickly here. So I can start to look at stuff like, I don't have much data in this one here, but I can start to look at stuff like, hey, for this specific user, what errors are they seeing? What successful calls are they doing? What's their growth rate like? What's their average latency? I can start to look at all of these things. And I can also do the same for a specific company. So let me just see here. If I go event type is API call, I'll do greater than 100 times here. So I'll click on intercom.com here, and I can explore theirs, and I can see that they're subscribed to this API in Stripe, and they're subscribed to e-sign requests. And I can see what their usage looks like. But the cool part is that if I click on dashboard here, I can also see stuff like daily volume by API, daily API growth rate. So there's a lot of these metrics that are applicable from the business side as well. Daily active users by API, daily active users on web. So I can start to see stuff like, hey, look, we plan to have, each company should have a minimum of 15 folks using our API, or we want to at least have 15 accounts using the API. You can start to measure that type of stuff. Now, When you come into Moesif in the live event log here, this is like a live stream of all of the events coming in. So you can see stuff like when it says action name, we can see stuff like viewed landing, viewed docs. Remember how we talked about being able to track when someone comes in, maybe looks at a blog, then goes to sign up page, then actually signs up, then makes their first API call. In Moesif, you can actually string together all of those journeys. So here I can see that someone called the e-signature documents API. If I click this here, I can see what their request is, what the response is, and I'm able to see what user used it, what company they're part of. And this is all possible because every single API call gets attributed with a user, and it also gets attributed with a company. So therefore, we're able to start building out those charts that we talked about in the presentation. Now, I'm going to try and run through this really quickly here. I can also do stuff like show API usage by company. So we showed that chart before. I'm going to open up a segmentation chart, and I'm going to filter this by company domain. And here I can see the top 5 companies that are using my API based on event count. So I can see that Firebase.com in the last 7 days, they've made 1,430 calls to my API. I can also see that Google Workspace.com, they've made 1,179. Now, we talked about using unique users instead of just, raw events. I can start going like this and say, okay, it might change the chart even. I want to measure it by unique users. So this churns through, and now I can see, so we've actually got a few different things here. So now we'll see that Firebase.com is still number 1. They have 75 unique users, and they did, I think, 1,200 API calls. But we can now see that Yext is actually our 5th most used API in terms of, unique users in the last 7 days. And we can also take a look at, if I come to telco, show you one last thing here quickly before we take off. So if we start to look at time series, we talked about actually measuring value, not just API calls. This is a telco demo data set. And instead of just doing event count, what I want to do is in the API request, in the response body, there is total messages sent. Now I can see for all of my APIs, for my telco APIs, I can see not just how many API calls have happened, because maybe there's API calls that just haven't really delivered much value. Now I can actually see how many messages have actually been sent through my APIs based on, in the API's response body, there's a field for total messages sent, and I'm creating a sum of all of that. I could also look at what's the average. So what's the average amount of total messages sent? Well, we can see here that on average, it's 100. All right, folks, I know we're at the top of our time here. I had a few more things I wanted to go through. However, if you see anything that you want me to dig into further, I'm happy to link up with you for a call. Also happy to hook you up with our sales team as well, who run absolutely fantastic demos and all of this stuff. So thank you so much for joining. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. I believe you can respond directly through the Zoom invite as well. But if not, definitely engage with us on socials or through our website. Thanks so much for joining, folks. Bye.